is good. So tonight, this is a fascinating one in a way because it involves a look into a book that was published recently, an edited collection by Lia Shimada, who we're going to introduce. And there you are there, the book called Mapping Faith, Theologies of Migration and Community. And this was basically, this came out of a meeting I had with Lia, who's with us. I'm really pleased, of course, is with us. A meeting we had, I think it was at Lambeth Palace, at a session of dialogue run through the chief rabbi and the United Synagogue, where I met Lia. I've been involved in that session, and which has developed since actually. And we met up after that, and Lia had asked me to write a chapter in this book, which was really exciting to be part of something. Writing a book is a very special thing, which I haven't done and really would love to do, but to certainly write a chapter and be part of a group who write is super. So Lia is a mediator and an academic. Lia works a great deal in mediation, in a sense, in peace building, mediation, community understanding, and also through consulting work, also as an academic, I should add, at the University of Roehampton in geography, but also in theological aspects. So geography, where geography meets theology. And that's really what we're sort of going to look at, where space, right, movement in space between locations, which is often what we think of as migration, meets theology, right, religion, faith, understandings of the world, and where they both meet together. So I was really, really pleased to be part, of that work. And with that, I'd love to welcome Lia, a warm Muswell Hill welcome to our group here. And over to Lia here to give us an overview of the book. Then Lia will then look at an aspect, actually it's through an artistic aspect in the book, which will be really fascinating, and it's shining a light on migration and movement. And then I'll talk about my chapter, and then we'll have a discussion. And there'll be time in that, I'm sure Lia will bring that up as well, for those of you here to have a discussion, to come with questions and to interact with what we're doing. So great to see you again. Over to you, Lia, to start us off.
Thank you. Thank you. Huge thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I just want to say one thing very quickly, which is I am having a terrible internet connection tonight. So if I go in and out, I do apologize. My husband's putting the children to bed and he's going to troubleshoot as soon as he can. But fingers crossed, we'll be smooth sailing from this point on. I also want to say that in the Christian calendar, today is the first Sunday of Advent, and it just feels really special to be able to spend time with you this evening. And even though I'm not with you in person, as Rabbi David said, there is something really special about almost like the early days of the pandemic, being able to come together and to share and to really explore. So thank you for the warm welcome, and I'm really looking forward to our time together. I am here to talk to you about this book, which Rabbi David has just mentioned. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the origin of the book, how I came to really become passionate about producing this. I'll tell you just a bit about the shape of the book, and then we'll have some time for discussion, looking at some of the art that I commissioned before hearing from Rabbi David about the chapter that he wrote for this book. So I am going to share my screen now, and Beth is going to help me out if this is not looking great. Can you all see that? Great, okay. Well, I wanted to start just by sharing you a little bit about how I came up with this project. About 10 years ago, I did my very first trip to the Holy Land and was just amazed by everything that I saw and experienced, particularly this building, which some of you might know, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, also known as the Ibrahimi Mosque. And as a Christian pilgrim, it was really so astounding to me to step into a space that is known by so many names, that is a family tomb, that's a holy site, and that's shared by multiple religions. As both a geographer and a practicing Christian, as a person of faith, I was really fascinated by this site in particular, but by the movement through the building, and just thinking about what it means to have a holy site that's shared, and all of the history coming into it, all of the questions coming out of it, and the real potential for dialogue that I was just really interested in seeing if we could hold through a book project. So a few years later, back in London, I had organized a big conference at the University of Roehampton on the theme of migration and ministry. And it was at that conference that I was approached by the publisher of the book with the request to write a book about migration and theology. And I kept returning to my memories of that visit to the Holy Land. And what I realized was I didn't want to write a book all on my own. I thought that would be both lonely, but also quite boring, both for myself and also for the people reading it. What I really wanted to do was create a project that would bring different religious perspectives into dialogue with each other. And what seemed feasible in terms of securing a publishing contract was a dialogue between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim voices. So I just want to say a quick word about the so-called Abrahamic religions. As you probably are aware, it's more than just the big three, more than just Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Some of you might be familiar with books by Adam Silverstein and Jared Russell. I really recommend them for just some really beautiful writing about the nuance of this whole idea of Abrahamic religions. And as we're probably aware, there are a whole family of religions that kind of nest under this idea. But as with any project, it did need some boundaries and coherence. And that was really what I decided to write about. And another editor obviously would have produced a very different book. Oh, this is one of the books I mentioned. This is quite an academic book, but I think a very good overview. And this one is just a lovely book. It's a travel writing, some really fabulous maps. I highly recommend both of them. So Mapping Faith, Theologies of Migration and Community was published by Jessica Kingsley, which is an imprint of Hachette. And it was published right in the middle of the pandemic. And one of the things that I want to say is that I wanted to create a book that ordinary people would want to read. So in other words, a book that would feel more at home in a book group than in a university library. And as Rabbi David may remember, the briefing that I gave to all of the contributors was to imagine that you are writing a chapter for a book group. You're trying to communicate with a book group that meets within a faith tradition that is not your own. And let me tell you that as the editor, it was really interesting to work with a whole range of people from a variety of faith perspectives, and to just understand where people needed to be challenged in terms of opening up what for many people you would just take for granted, right? This is just, everyone would understand this concept. But then given the task of writing for a different tradition, what does that look like? What are people coming to with completely fresh eyes? So there were some really big questions that I wanted to ask of this book. What is migration? How do we understand the presence of God in people on the move? How does faith shape migration and vice versa? How does migration shape our understanding of community in the context of faith? And above all, I was really curious to learn more about my own faith tradition through this process of walking alongside other people as they also grappled with these large questions. So once the book contract was in place, which, oh my goodness, it was in 2016, I think. And so as you can see, it was a very, very long period of bringing this project to the printed version. But once the book contract was in place, I went to work, and I knew from the outset that I wanted to commission as even a spread as possible between voices across the three faith traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that are represented in this book. And to the extent possible, I also wanted to commission a range of perspectives within each tradition. So I come from a very liberal Christian background myself. It would have been very easy for me to find lots of other people who thought the same as me. But really my challenge for myself was to find a range of perspectives. I also really wanted broad balances in terms of gender and age and also UK geography. As we're all aware, it feels like London is the center of the world, but I did feel a responsibility to reach much further beyond this city to get voices from other parts of the country. And I also wanted to contribute or commission different types of contributions. So essays, obviously, it's a book, so there are going to be a lot of words, but also poetry and art. Let me just back up one second. So in the end, I commissioned over 35 different contributors. These were writers, poets, artists, and practitioners from a broad range of predominantly, although I have to say not exclusively, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian backgrounds. So for example, the artist Issam Corbage, whose work we're going to explore later this evening, only participated on the condition that I would give him space to say why he did not want to be pigeonholed as a Muslim artist. And I said, yes, have as much space as you want. That's a wonderful thing to bring into a project about theology and migration and community. So the book itself is structured around 3 broad themes. One is faith encounters, and really taking quite a broad and creative look. So not just thinking about encounters between different religious traditions, but also what is it like to encounter a different aspect of your own faith? And Rabbi David's chapter sits within this theme and really, really beautifully addresses it. The second theme was about sacred text. As you can imagine, there's a lot of really wonderful theological reflection that we can do about migration and its relationship with holy text, sacred text. And the third theme was on diaspora, which I think as the editor was for me was the most fun theme to pull together and to commission. So these 3 themes hold together, but obviously there is a lot of cross-pollination between them, a lot of dialogue within the book between these nominal themes. So each of these 3 sections within the book contains 7 essays, contributions from 2 poets, and images and reflections from a visual artist. So the other thing I want to say is that inevitably the book reflects my own interests and curiosity as the editor. If any of you wants to produce a book, I have to say that this is one of the great perks of being the editor, that and actually getting to commission the person who's going to do your cover as well. And as you can probably tell, I had a lot of fun with that. So there are a number of contributions that I think quite naturally explore the book's themes through my own curiosities, through a feminist lens, for instance, and through the voices of migrants and refugees themselves. That was really important to me, that I could find creative ways to bring the voices of migrants and refugees into this project. And we found all sorts of very interesting and creative ways to make sure that their voices really came in as unfiltered as possible. The book was published in June 2020. So if you rewind your memory back to that, it was right in the middle of the pandemic. I have to say, I was quite grateful for it. I was expecting another baby, so it was really good to be able to do a lot of my book tour online. And in some ways, this coming together with you this evening brings back a lot of really fond memories from that time. And the other thing I want to say is that all proceeds from this book are donated to the Helen Bamber Foundation, which is a really fantastic London-based charity that works with migrants who have suffered extremes of human cruelty, including trafficking and torture. So it's been a really special opportunity to be able to support the work of the Helen Bamber Foundation through sales of the book. So in terms of what we want to do with the session tonight, it falls into 2 distinct parts, as Rabbi David said. I'm going to wrap up talking about the shape of the book, and then we're going to look at some examples of art from the book itself. Just want to do a quick time check. We have plenty of space. Yeah, I think we'll be fine. And then I am going to give us a bit of time for some discussion about one of the examples of the piece of art we'll look at. I'll read a bit of the chapter itself. And then after that, we'll pivot, and I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi David to tell you about this really stunning chapter that he wrote. I'm really excited that he has this opportunity to share it with you, and I hope that you'll be able to read it in its entirety in the book at some point. So what I'd really like to do first is just run you really quickly through some of the art that I commissioned. There was a map maker that I commissioned named Catherine Baxter, who produced both the cover picture, but also the art for the section on faith encounters. For sacred text, I commissioned Jacqueline Nichols, whom some of you might know. Really fantastic artist as well. She did the art for the section on sacred text. And then we're going to really spend lots of time thinking about diaspora and migration and the refugee crisis through a piece of art that was created by Issam Korbaj, and I'll tell you a bit more about him in just a few minutes. So just to take you on a very quick whistle-stop tour through some of the art, this is one of the maps that I commissioned from Catherine Baxter, who is a professional map maker and also a Methodist local preacher, a Methodist lay preacher. She's based at Wesley's Chapel on City Road. Her chapter is just a really wonderful meditation on the similarities between preaching and map making, and some really stunning work on visual theology as well. This is the other map that I had commissioned from her. I said, please, can you try to put as many holy sites as possible from the 3 religions represented in this book onto one map? She came back and said, that was really tricky, but I finally found the right vantage point. So in the book itself, you can obviously see this in more detail. But what I really love is just the level of detail and the care she puts into all of these maps. Jacqueline Nichols has this wonderful tradition of coming to a piece of sacred text, writing it out by hand, disrupting it, and letting some art flow from that. It's part of her daily spiritual discipline. I really wish we had time to explore her chapter, because for me it was just one of the most beautiful pieces of writing that I had the privilege of working on for this project. It's a really wonderful meditation that she offers in the form of her chapter about migration, about walking, about the way that art is a process of pilgrimage. And I hope that you have a chance to read this as well. But really what we want to talk about today is this installation by the artist Issam Korbaj. And just to tell you a bit about Issam, he is originally from Syria. He trained in fine art, architecture, and theater design, and currently lives and teaches at the University of Cambridge. Since 2011, he's devoted his artistic and political energy to responding to the crisis in Syria. And for this book, he very generously offered images from 4 different installations. And I've just chosen one of them to share with us today. So this one is called Dark Water, Burning World. It's made of bicycle mudguards, matches, and resin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read you first his description of the installation, and then I'll read an excerpt from the interview that I conducted with him, which appears as the chapter that he contributed for this book. And then we'll have a bit of discussion all together before we go to Rabbi David's contribution. So let me start by just reading in Issam's own words how he describes the origins of this piece of art. This piece originated as a response to a small artifact from Syria, 2,500 years old, in the collection of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. A miniature model ship carries 3 goddesses. The minute that I saw it, I immediately saw my project. The original piece is made of lead, and I thought, lead and boats, it will sink. My first experiments were in lead, but that didn't last long. Then I noticed my bicycle mudguards. Mud, guard. Its function is to guard, but many of my fellow Syrians were not guarded by the dangerous, flimsy boats made from cheap, poor quality rubber. They might as well have been made from lead. So I started making my artwork from mudguards and spent matches. Resin holds the matches upright, suggesting that in desperate times, people bond, hold, and support each other. Symbolically, I tackled the reality of colossal damage by burning these matches. The burnt parts might be read as a reflection on the trauma that women, children, and men carry with them. And then I went on to interview him in Cambridge. I recorded the interview, and Issam and I worked together to craft a chapter that spoke to all of the art that he'd contributed, but also brought in a lot of the ideas that he wanted to share in this space around movement, about home and identity. So here's just a short excerpt from that interview. How do you hope, I asked, how do you hope that your 4 images will challenge or provoke the readers of this book to think differently about migration? And Issam replied, any form of art requires a speaker and a listener, a performer and an audience. So the responsibility is both mine and the viewers. Although my images are referencing Syria, I would like them to be universal rather than local. I would like them to be about something whose meaning we all struggle with. Home. Where is it? Where to find it? Is it in front of or behind our skin? We migrate for different reasons. We are curious beings. We need to see the unseen, so we travel the world in search for connection with unfamiliar lands and unfamiliar communities. We need to wander beyond our physical homes, but we always need a piece to remind us of it. So I'm going to exit the screen share now, and Beth is going to just pop a few reflection questions into the chat space just to get us started. So the questions are, how does this set of images speak to you in light of current events? That's the first question. And the second question is, how does it develop or challenge your understanding of migration and faith and community? And then the third question that just to hold in mind is, what does it say to you about the tension between settled and restless? So as I give you just a moment to think about those 3 questions, and please don't feel any obligation to reply to all of them. Really it's just a starting point to get us thinking and talking. I'm just going to ask Rabbi David to help facilitate the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, so please come in. I mean, it's really good to hear your thoughts on what Lia has said on that, the installation. And this will sort of segue quite well into my chapter as well, in a way, in terms of what's going on, right? Clearly, in terms of our approach to migration, it's a big thing, a big issue in the news. It's something that we cannot avoid. We talk about a lot, we hear a lot. And I remember myself being quite involved in bringing what was going on with the Syrian migration to my community, to other communities. So the image that you've seen, does that have any, are there any reactions here to that? I'd be lovely to hear. And again, what does it say about the tension between being settled? I thought that quote from the chapter was wonderful. Issam's chapter was wonderful. So don't be shy, as I know you're not. If you want to come in, unmute yourself, put your hand up, virtual or real, whatever. Who's going to take the plunge? You don't have to. Or in thinking mode. Judith.
I'll just say one thing. So we're all very aware in the news about people fleeing from war zones and becoming refugees and so on. And that image of the matches in the boat was particularly struck a particular chord with me, because just last night on Netflix, I saw a film called The Swimmers about a Syrian family. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it is pretty unbelievable film. And they were trying to escape in a boat, and it was flimsy, and there were loads of people, and there were refugees from loads of different countries who shared a little bit of themselves. So that simple image became extra powerful to me. You know, it's an inflammatory situation, you know, about to be extinguished. So great that you put it in the book.
Thank you, Judith. That's certainly a film I'm going to look up. Yeah, The Swimmers. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that's, you know, the fact that it resonated with you is quite something that's quite powerful. Anyone else? Feel free to come in.
I suppose that juxtaposition of settled and restless makes it sound like it's a choice. And it jarred with me slightly, I think, for that reason, because it's not as if the people who stay as they were, and it's not necessarily restlessness that drives those who move. So it felt like a slightly odd juxtaposition. I'm just trying to work out what I make of that. You know, for the people who move on, what's left behind, what's there behind them isn't what they left behind either.
I just want to say, one of the poets that I commissioned for this book, actually for that same theme on diaspora, is a young, really rising star in the poetry world. He's from Syria, and he came via Calais. Actually, I think in the end he ended up coming into Newcastle, stowing away on a ship. His name is Amir Darwish, and he contributed 4 poems into this collection. And I'm not going to read the poems to you because this is a space to hear from you, but I just want to tell you the titles of the 4 poems that he has contributed to this book. They are Dear Refugee, We Want to Live, What I Left Behind, and Where I Come From.
Tantalizing.
And that was the order. That was the order in which he wanted them presented in the book.
And that order had specific meaning for him in terms of the journey. I'm wondering whether that, yeah, gosh, it is hard because I think that's something that I suppose it leads into what I wrote about. We often, we're talking about problematizing. We negate often, and we denigrate the concept of migration. Everyone hear me, by the way? I'm worried that you all froze there for a moment. So often we fear migration because of the fact that obviously there is pain involved. There is dislocation involved.
You froze for a moment, but you're back.
Sorry about that. I hope this is not continuing. I know I'm not just Leah. I've got. Is that better now?
Mm-hmm.
No. Oh. Is that all right, everyone? Is that Rona? Do you hear me? Yeah. So we thanks. So yeah. So we often alienate or negate or denigrate the concept of migration, maybe out of fear of it, the unsettledness of it. And in some ways, I suppose there is something about, obviously, yes, there are elements of it when it's forced, it's bad, it's difficult, it's problematic. But the nature is to always then look to resettle, to immediately to go to find home, to settle. And there's something here about migration and the unsettledness of it, which isn't bad in life. So we always search for home. We always want home. We always want that sense of rootedness, which is good, also important. But is there something also with which breeds opportunity by being unsettled, by being relocated, even if it is somewhere, even if it's in a reason which we would not want. Here we are Jewish people, right? We are born out of migration, born out of dislocation, born out of movement, and have taken opportunity from where we are, right? We've taken the opportunity rather than being, in a sense, settled, and we've taken the opportunities that a new place has given us. But does anyone else want to come in on that? I mean, Rona's point was really, it's not a simple point. It's a really good one. Does anyone else want to come in? We're trying to say there's a difference here between being settled somewhere. Is there a cost for being settled, or being restless and not always wanting to be settled fully? And that can come in different layers, can't it? I suppose it could be the way we are in terms of how we think. It can be where we live. It doesn't have to be all that. You know, it doesn't have to be just about moving physically. It could be about the way we think. So anyone else want to come in on that initial? I see Rona freeze here, and I worry that I'm not being heard, but I am assuming I will be.
No, we're hearing you. You're freezing everything else back.
Gillian, if you want to come in. I think you're muted there.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about when I work with trans migrants, we used to talk about the push factor and the pull factor. And when the push factor was really high, and the pull factor to different places, it depended where they would go, depending on the pull factor somewhere else. These are not decisions necessarily made out of a rational mind. They're made often in times of distress and great hardship. And sometimes you have to weigh opportunity against a likelihood of going somewhere familiar, somewhere where you have other people whom you know and a circle to connect to that will make it easier, even if the opportunity is less. But the picture, I want to say the picture of them as matchsticks in a floating boat really brought back all the trauma of watching the news years ago about the Greek islands and about the numbers of drownings and numbers of people who died on the way, and from North Africa who died on the way to Spain. And it's very hard to see these images for me. Just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Anyone else want to come in? I'm interested in the sense in what do we mean by home? I think that was something that really interested me about that chapter, Islam's chapter. What do we actually mean? I mean, you know, there's a Jewish resonance to that, but everyone has that. What exactly do we mean? You know, I think what was it? His home is a very complex concept. I'm still searching for it, he says. So given that we as Jewish people often talk about home in terms of Israel, and we go to Israel and we say we feel at home, and yet at least still half of the Jewish people live outside of Israel. The vision that, you know, the diaspora would collapse because of Zionism, the state of Israel, isn't real, because still millions of people live in parts of the world other than Israel. And so does that make more complicated our concept of home? What does home mean to us? I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that, because that was a really interesting point that was made. Rona, I sense you coming in there.
No, I think migration makes this concept of home very complicated. I mean, if I think about, you know, there's a bit of me that's still really, so my family story. So my grandparents are originally from Iraq. There's a piece of me that still says I'm an Iraqi Jew, never mind the Israel piece as well. But the Iraq of my grandparents doesn't exist in any meaningful sense at all, certainly not in Iraq. Does it exist in bits of the diaspora? What does it exist in? It exists in language, food, stories, bits of culture. So those are a little bit of home that stay with you. There's the bits of home that you collect as you pass through places as well. You know, all of those places you pass through leave you with a little bit of a different kind of home that's still part of your personal concept of home. I just think, I would say in that sense, migration is enriching for sure. I feel that, but it's complicated. It does leave you with this complicated sense of who you are. I mean, I have to say, listening to the politics of the last few years, and we don't necessarily need to go there, that was something that was really uncomfortable, because you look at that and say, all right, well, this is about our people and our home, and that then leaves you asking the question, well, actually, do I even have an equivalent to that? To which the answer is no, not really.
Yeah, wow. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Really fascinating. I think David Lawson, David, you made a point in the chat. Do you want to say that out, David? If you want to unmute and make that point, I think it was quite fascinating. I'm happy to read it out, but I think it'd be nice coming from you. So, David, if you hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can totally hear you. Brilliant.
Oh, aren't I lucky?
Go on.
The question relates to, and I can't remember who decided there are categories of people, the somewhere people who are quite happy to live anywhere, to live in a specific place and not to move. And then there are anywhere people who are happy to live anywhere. And is this somehow tied in with religion? I mean, are Jews particularly anywhere people, either because that's psychologically who they are, or perhaps they've been forced to be anywhere people by historical circumstance?
It's actually fascinating, David, as well, because the anywhere, there's something, I think the anywhereness comes in a way from what Rona was saying about accretion of, adding on layers of identity given migration. But actually the anywhereness has often been to the detriment of Jewish people, because sometimes anti-Semitism actually comes from that. What do they call? There was always the conversation about what we were, the rootless cosmopolitan. There was this idea that the Jew. I remember an actually essay by a famous Israeli writer called A.B. Yehoshua. A.B. Yehoshua wrote an article, I can find it, about anti-Semitism, where he said our borderlessness is what leads to anti-Semitism. But there's always a lack of knowledge as to where the Jew will penetrate. Now that's really serious stuff, right? Obviously, but so almost there's a desire to want to contribute to universalism, right? A universalism based on harmony in humanity, but that could be used against us because, hey, we're Jews, right?
Yeah, and if your idea of home is tied to a specific sense of place, it's very difficult. If you've migrated once, you can migrate again, right? There's.
Yeah. I think we lost you, Rona. I thought it was me, but it's Rona.
I just want to say something on that point of David's, which I thought was stunning as well. I'm reading from Issam's chapter, which I think connects really strongly with that point. He talks about where he comes from, and he started migrating out of his hometown, really pulled by art. He wanted to study art in a way that he wasn't able to do in the physical place that he called home. And he says, home is a very complex concept. I don't know what to call it. I'm still searching for it. In my quest for home, I learned to respect the other. I am a palimpsest. Each layer is a trace of different cultures I lived in and people I connected with. And he goes on to tie this to why he really hates labels. Labels fix things. And then I'm just going to end by this line that I think really is so stunning. There are so many labels that somehow solidify the liquidity of our spirit. We need to treasure this liquidity as a catalyst to connect with others.
Yeah, fascinating.
I'm just mindful of the time, Rabbi David. Do you want to?
I will take it away. Yes.
To talk about your chapter now.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. Yes, you put the definitely pressure on me already in your praise for it, but it was a really good experience. I think writing is very cathartic when you've got something you want to express. So, and I think we've touched upon it already. When I was in Israel and I was studying in yeshiva, right, and I'll explain that to Lia, a place of Jewish learning. Very much, number one, I'm in Israel, which is this sort of end point. Redemption is about the return of the Jewish people to Israel. It's about ending, right? It's about ending exile. And also within Jewish theology, Redemption is really big. The idea that there's a messianic era that ends the period, a long, torturous period of exile, and ends it with this redemptive period where everyone gets on, Jewish people return, the world is, there's love all over the world, there's peace, etc. It's very big. And what it then, what I started thinking a lot more about when I was there was, number one, we're not there. And are we missing out a sense of what exile can be? Oh, exile, again, often is something which is physical, migratory concept. We move away from place and we move to another place and then another place. Exile can also be exile from person, right? It could be that I change how I think. So it made me think when I was in Israel that maybe we're missing something here of being so negative about exile, right? So we think of migration as a geographical dislocation, right? And a movement from one place, right? Often a place of settledness, a home, to a new place. That's how we often look at migration. And actually it's pertinent for me at the moment because I am going to undertake a migration of sorts because I'm moving on, as I hope you do all know, because the message came out on Friday that I'm, now, in 6 months' time, we'll be moving on from the great Muslim synagogue, which I've loved very much. But in a sense, because I don't want to be settled or overly settled, in some ways, what I'm doing by that, because it would be pretty easy for me to stay as a rabbi, and then you would all be in about 5-10 years' time going, oh gosh, he's a bit stale, that Rabbi David. And, really, we could do with a new rabbi and he's all right, but you know what, so I'm unsettling myself for that. So in my chapter, I reflect on this movement and how through my life, I've understood more about the importance of migration in life, and that migration, again, this sense of exiling from somewhere which you could think of as fully home, moving on from somewhere where you're really settled, right? And it doesn't mean I'm telling you all to get up, sell your house and move somewhere, because it could be something about in the mind. It could be a way of thinking. It could be about us as a people and how we should think. It could just be simply the fact that we accept that even although we are all geographically in the exile, we're all in the diaspora, that's okay. That even although the idea was that diaspora is meant to end, blah, 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 and we're all meant to go and live in Israel, well, actually, that's not happened. And that there's a lot we can give by living in diaspora. So like many people, I wrote that my life, like many Jewish people in this country, came from migration. Firstly, of the forced type, right? Of course, in terms of my mum and dad are here. My mum's parents escaped Germany. My dad's parents came from Romania, from Lithuania, from Ukraine. There's a lot of migration there, which is similar to what Rona picked up on in terms of the Syrian migration. It's forced. None of my grandparents really foresaw that their grandchildren would be in Britain. They had to move because of circumstances where they were from. But then there's also migration not of the forced type. My dad was brought up in Bristol, my mum in Luton. My dad gets a job in Edinburgh in the civil service as a microbiologist. So I was then born in Scotland. And I write positively about the effect that Scotland had on my path. I now can't necessarily live in Scotland. As a religious Jew, it's not simple to live in Scotland. You could, I suppose, it's not unheard of. And there are religious Jews there, but to go back wouldn't be simple. And yet I look at Scotland as having a really important effect on who I am. I write, my Scottish upbringing was fundamental to my development. From a young age, I understood the sense of being an underdog. I should say that in a Scottish accent, shouldn't I? Being an underdog, right? Of being part of a vulnerable nation and the tragedies that result in needing to fight for your national existence. So my Scottishness and my Jewishness, there's actually a lot of overlap there. I still talk of Scotland as a homeland. I still go to Scotland and feel a homeness there, even if I do not yearn to return. Scotland bequeathed me a sense of reflectiveness on identity, political awareness, and an understanding of power and how it plays out between people. And I'm not saying I'm a Scottish National Party card carrier, okay, everyone? But my Scottishness clearly was something that was important to me. But along with a physical migration, Scotland to London, I also made a religious one as well, to a more observant life. And that, for many in the religious world, it was a migration away from stuff they felt difficult in their life to a new settledness. So we have a term, I talk about this term in the book, the term the Baal Teshuvah. The Baal Teshuvah is the person who does repentance. It's often used in a denigratory way about someone who's just got quite frum and who's seen the light. You know, one day he's got jeans that are ripped, the next day he's got a black hat and, you know, and payas, you know, like he's gone very frum very quickly. Ah, he's a Baal Teshuvah. Actually, for many people, it's a positive name about themselves. They've become religious. It technically means someone who did something wrong, who decides they're not going to do that wrong anymore. They've done teshuvah. So it's a migration in a way. It's a change. It's a movement. And what's fascinating, I'll read you a small paragraph in my chapter. Being Baal Teshuvah, becoming more religious, is clearly a migration, a movement. The great 12th century Jewish scholar Maimonides, echoing Talmud, lists exile as one of the paths a person may take towards tshuva, towards return. So Maimonides is saying there, in order for you to actually get somewhere else religiously, you need to unsettle yourself. Go and move somewhere else, think differently, shake yourself up. And that might make you think a bit differently. A person needs to, now I'm reading my book, a person needs to migrate away from his everyday existence in order to find space to reflect on how he can repair and develop his soul. Today, in an era where the state of Israel is so integral to Jewish identity, it is important to see the therapeutic and character-building impact of exile, diaspora. This may mean physical relocation to areas where more religious Jews live. Many will do that. What worried me, though, was that when people became religious, it almost became a new settledness, and that they lost that sense of the need for unsettledness and not being restless in their religiosity. I went to places in Israel. I went to one yeshiva in Israel. I studied with Beth's husband there and had a great time studying together. And but I remember people often who had you know, in a sense, looked back on their previous sort of their life in partial, in difficult, complicated manner. Maybe there was guilt, how they had been, how they had acted. And so this new settledness would take over. Now I'm religious, that's it. That's what I will be. And there was an inability to be a little bit, even within the boundaries of the new identity, a little bit restless. So this migration that I undertook with all its restlessness, reflectiveness, brought me to understand then how migration was not a bad thing. I had migrated from Scotland. I moved, I changed, I've gone to London, a very different place. I migrated as a student into a world of religiosity. In that world itself, I migrated, I'd gone back to Israel, right, to a homeland, and then had come back, of course, here to be a rabbi, a religious individual in a community of a wide spectrum of religiosity, wanting to feel community. There's a lot of, and now here, of course, here I go, I'm going to do it again. So therefore, it made me understand that migration is not to be alienated. It's something that should be considered, thought about. And when others suffer in migration, especially if it is forced, and this comes back to Rona's point, it's going to be sometimes really hard. Migration is not easy for anyone, but we can be there for people. So there will be many people who will go through a sense of a restlessness and will thrive on it. For many, it isn't easy, but community can support people through that process. And I suppose I'm just thinking now that here's an interesting thought I've had, if I may share, was we did a night shelter. I think I refer to it in my book, in my chapter, sorry, in the community of Muswell Hill. I'm sure some of you here would have volunteered for that. And I remember, so people who are homeless are coming in. I remember one of the members of the community was like really worried about how they might look because they might condescend. You know, maybe I need to have something ripped because I'm with someone who's homeless. There was very much a worry about, you know, focusing on their journey, their journey, in a sense, in a way that condescends possibly, and that's understandable. But actually, it was almost saying it's okay to be homeless. We need to support the person, and we need to be there for them. But there is an equivalence of humanity, nevertheless. So when I sat on the floor in northern Greece, on the border between Greece and Macedonia, and I was seeing every 15 minutes a group of 100 refugees go, it was like the clock, every 50 minutes into Europe through Macedonia. My desire was to relate to them as people. What are their stories? They're migrants, right? And that's the terrible inhumanity that we're putting people through in Manston, in the south, and other places. We're dehumanizing, we're objectifying, rather than relating to people who are on a journey as people, because we all go on journeys. So in my chapter, I muse on the Orthodox world and actual migration, and how I work to bring my colleagues in the rabbinate to see what was going on in the world regarding the forced migration, especially in the Syrian crisis in 2015. So almost you might think of orthodoxy as being settled, stayed in its ways, right? Focused on redemption completely and fully. What I'm trying to do is say that even within identity, there can be a restlessness which reflects, thinks, who are we? What is home? What are others' homes? And therefore be able to step up and step forward to help other people in their trouble, in their tribulation, and in their suffering. So I've always looked at two pillars in my Judaism, the inward enrichment and the outward presence. And I loved a statement that was made by Issam in his chapter that Lia brought up, where he talked about being in front of or behind my skin. Always look at what's in front of or behind my skin, almost being able to maintain my identity inside and unabashedly, but also not allowing that to block me from what's going on outside to others. So I'll end just by a paragraph from a book by Michael Walzer, who's an American philosopher, a Jewish American philosopher, who talks about the problem of utopia. I think someone's not muted here, but don't worry. It's Rona. Sorry, Rona. I'm going to mute you.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, don't be so. It's fine. So, so he writes a book called Exodus and Revolution. Don't worry, nothing complimentary about revolution. It's almost the opposite. His point is that revolutionary politics that looks at this utopian endpoint always focuses on getting to an end, the revolution, right? The end point. You see that even in a liberal sense. Francis Fukuyama wrote the book The End of History in the early 90s, right? The Last Man Standing. And it now almost said it didn't work fully, right? The idea was liberal democracy would be an end point. In our religion, in Judaism, there is a focus at the moment. Look, religious Zionism is a political party now, which will become part of the government, which is very right-wing, very problematic, and is so focused on this end point that living in Israel is messianic, that it forgets people. It forgets the migrating journey of people, actual people, and their journeys, that their journeys are very, very different. And he writes here that Exodus politics is about pragmatism. These are his words. We still believe, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught about the meaning and possibility of politics, about its proper form. First, that wherever you live it is probably Egypt. Just that's quite a deep statement. That wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. I think that is a lovely, lovely, lovely chapter, a paragraph. And I say to that, and so I have come to experience migration to migration. That evolution, that migration has taken me to a place where I understand migration and exile to be core elements of identity. So I've migrated, but I've also internally migrated in my life to understanding that migration is okay, that migration is something we need to deal with. Throwing off a sense of exile and migration, right, rejecting it, comes with serious threats of narcissism, self-obsession, and a reduced ability to relate to the other. That's really me. I mean, it reminds me when I was once in Israel. I lived in the territories for a year or two in the occupied, right, the West Bank, or into the settlement, right, Judea, Samaria, whatever you call it, the occupied territories. I lived there, and I was teaching in a school, and I bumped into a Norwegian cameraman, and he asked me, what do I think about the best way forward for peace? I think he got the wrong person, because he wanted some right-wing settler, and I was like, not that sort of person. But I did say, look, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I am not interested in pushing redemption, because I believe that God will bring it. I'm a religious Jew. God will decide when that is. In the meantime, what I've got to do is look after people and make sure that if we move forward to that redemption and leave people behind, and in a sense, ignore the suffering of others and other people's journeys, I think that is really problematic. So anyway, that's some stuff. I hope that's done it justice, Lia, because you'll know that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I want to say it was a huge privilege to work on that chapter with you. I really loved the whole process, from our initial conversations to working together on the drafts, and really seeing it come alive, and how it speaks into and through other chapters in the collection. It's a beautiful piece of work.
Thank you.
Just in the interest of time, I just have really one question that I wanted to ask just to start our discussion, and that was, how do we stay alert to restlessness? How do we cultivate it spiritually?
And is that to me initially, Lia?
It's to you initially.
Yes. Yes. Wow. I suppose there's two things I'd say. One is by I think curiosity. I've always thought that curiosity, I think Rona actually touched on that before, in terms of curiosity about where you come. You know, we might not, you know, you aren't living in Iraq, don't know, but you're curious about the impact on your sense of Iraqiness. So I think curiosity is absolutely ginormous. I'm a very curious person, but the curiosity comes with a lack of fear that I'm going to break my boundaries. I still think identity is important. So I'm Jewish, and that's quite an important part of my identity, but I'm really curious at getting to the edges and getting outside of my skin, as some would talk about, and listening to people. You know, I never dreamed of understanding what Alevism is. There is an Alevi community. Alevi are often Turkish Kurdish. They have fascinating ways of praying. I'm not Alevi. I'm not going to become necessarily Alevi. But for me, I was so curious for Marx to learn about the way they prayed through dance. Fascinating to pray by dance. Really interesting. That's because in this borough, Haringey, I've been blessed that there are large communities. So I think curiosity is probably one really important way. But combining that with a lack of fear, that curiosity means I'm going to break my boundary, because that's often what happens. It's the fear of what will happen that will stop the sense of curiosity. And that curiosity is a restlessness. It does bring in a sense of a tension of restlessness because you see difference. I see some hands.
I think I saw Judith had her hand up.
You're muted, Judith.
Found the cursor. So is this fear perhaps a fear that you'll lose your own self and your own identity? You won't be accepted for who you are. What I was thinking through all this is that assuming people are not migrating as a forced migration, if they're doing it because they want to, maybe at the bottom of it all, it's a search for the source of love and a place in the world and feeling secure where you can be at home in yourself and relaxed and accepted for who you are. And if we're in an environment where people don't want to know us and don't accept us, it's very threatening. But if I would suggest maybe, Rabbi, that you feel very secure in yourself, and that gives you the ability to move out into the world and be curious about other people. It's not going to threaten your own identity.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, security is it's a complicated concept. I think I sense the restlessness comes from sensing. It's all about interacting with people, isn't it? Because when you're interacting with people, you hear the different tensions. So I'm, as a religious Jew, I feel comfortable, and I want to learn, but I also sense, in terms of the Jew, for instance, in our religion, its relationship to issues of gender and sexuality and all sorts of issues is really complicated. So I might understand where I stand as a religion, but it's easy for me just to stand within the walls of the house of learning, as we say, and be settled there. Whereas actually that's not, probably for me, not enough, because I know that there are people who find that very difficult. It's hard, it's difficult. I think Jane did you have, we're going to go Scottish now, Jane and Michelin. Sorry, Leah, if I'm...
Thank you. Thank you both for very, very interesting sessions. So what's going through my mind is that you're talking about restlessness, and we've heard from Gillian about the push and pull factor. And to me, they might be parallel, they're not the same. So there are people that are pushed out, even today, sadly, in terrible circumstances. And the circumstances that are like my grandparents were also pushed out in terrible circumstances or didn't get out at all. But what I hear you talk about, Rabbi David, is almost a slight luxury of restlessness, that you're able to have that. And equally, you say you migrated to London, and you could say I migrated to Scotland from Liverpool or from London, whichever, whichever was the starting point. And but I wasn't pushed, I very much chose to, so to me that's so very different, so very, very different. It's a bit of a luxury of choice. I'm saying, I suppose controversially, that I don't just see them on one continuum. However, I do very much welcome. It's like taking up opportunity, but knowing that there's always risks with opportunities, but embracing change. But I do think that we're in quite a luxurious position to embrace it and to be able to, compared to what I generally would term as people who've migrated. And I'll stop there, but it's just some thoughts.
That's fascinating. Michelin, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think I'm probably saying the same thing as Jane. It's part of human nature to want to roam and explore and find new places and find new challenges. I mean, children, you know, used to leave home. They used to go to Australia and become 5-pound poms or whatever. People went in search of a new life. I mean, even 60,000 years ago, they went to Australia on rafts. We've now got this very crowded world where we know what's going on absolutely everywhere. So the search is to outer space, which you can see people trying to conquer now, if not through personal journeys, through instruments. So, I mean, I think that we can expect, it's part of human nature, certainly up to a certain age, to be restless and to want to roam about and explore. That's a totally different thing from being forced out of your home, which can happen to you at any age, including at very, very young and very old age, and where really there's a duty to provide asylum and refuge. And that's also age old, this idea of asylum and refuge. So I don't think we're necessarily discovering anything new with all this movement and migration and good migration, bad migration, and so on. I don't know if I'm adding anything to the conversation by saying.
No, it's helpful. It's definitely a Scottish Remainer approach there, definitely. Well, I'm just thinking of the fact that we stopped free movement, right? The whole point of Brexit was to stop free movement. So that goes against, in a way, the sort of roaming nature. Is there anyone else? I mean, we've obviously got a few minutes. I mean, it's an interesting point. I would just make, I think obviously relevant to you, Jane, and to Michelin as well, is that absolutely you're right. Obviously, there's a difference. I'm wondering if what I'm thinking about is how you relate to the person once they've reached the new place. In other words, there's a curiosity, of course, there's a support, there's an asylum. But then there's also about what that does to our home, right? You know, what happens to the new place, and the curiosity about the journey, finding out about and where they've come from, and the benefits that obviously that can be for us in our curiosity to think, oh wow, I can learn something about the culture from where they came, and what that does to us, and that can be unsettling and restless for some, because there's an understanding as to what British culture is or what America, you know. So I think there are ways to be able to, yes, you're right. There is a difference between the luxuriousness of moving from Scotland, betraying my Scottish roots and moving down to London, and at the same time, someone who's moved from Syria. But I think that there's still something to think about migration generally.
I'd like to come
Lia,
back to. I'd like to come back to Rona's chat comment about the most enriching place is to be on the border, and really interesting working with the publisher, but also with Catherine Baxter, the map maker who also designed the cover of the book. Catherine has an artistic discipline, which I think is also a spiritual discipline in a way, that every map she produces always has a border on it, because what she wants to do is disrupt the border. For example, I think you might be able to see there's a boat coming out of this border and some trees here. So for her, it's really important that every map she produces professionally has a border that is then disrupted. And we had some really interesting negotiations with the publisher's design team, because Catherine was adamant that any map she produces had to have a border that was disrupted. The publisher tried to say, oh, we don't want the border. And basically I was caught between Catherine saying, if you want the map, it's going to have a border that will then be disrupted. And I have to say, I'm really pleased that she won the argument, because I think this whole concept of the disrupted border really is thought-provoking, and I think in a very succinct way encapsulates a lot of the questions that we were exploring in this project.
Lovely. Well, it's possibly a good. Any other points? Because that's not a bad place to end, actually. We've got an hour and a quarter in, so that would be amazing if we actually keep to time. Does anyone else want to mention anything or make a point? I can certainly put a link in our WhatsApp group as to for the book. So if you want to get the book, you feel free to do that.
Well, I actually, on that note, I just have some really quick announcements and notices to share about that. So I'm going to pop my screen share back on very briefly. And I just want to say this book was made possible through my role as senior researcher at the Susanna Wesley Foundation, which is a partnership of the University of Roehampton with a lot of funding from the Methodist Church in Britain, hence the faith aspect. It's a community of scholarship to equip faith communities and those who work in them. And above all, it's really about dialogue, innovation, and practical theology. And the reason that I wanted to share this information with you is because I had mentioned earlier that there is poetry throughout the book. And one of the things that we have done is get recordings of all of the poets recording in their own voices, in their own words, the poetry that they contributed to the book. So it is all on this on the website for the foundation as a poetry archive, and we're developing some learning resources coming out of it as well. The book is widely available. I think Waterstone stocks it, W.H. Smith also online. And just again, I'm really delighted that all of the royalties from sales do go to the Helen Bamber Foundation. So again, supporting really powerful work that they do in community, particularly in London, but not exclusively, around supporting migrants. So I'm just going to stop there, but I want to say again, just thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you to Rabbi David for agreeing to step in and be part of this project. And it's just been a real joy to work with you.
And thank you as well, Lia, for asking me to write and be part of it and give me my first chapter, authored chapter in a book, which I hope I'm sure will follow up. And yeah,
let me say that I think he's got many more chapters inside him. So watch the space. I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing him in books all over the place.
Please God, that'd be lovely. Thank you, everyone. We can all give a clap. We can unmute and clap for Lia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And great to see you all. Thank you, Beth, as well, for your work in this as well. But really lovely to see you all. Lovely to be together, really, isn't it? I think it's great.
Yeah, very good.
And not have to drive home anywhere. And welcome all of you. Welcome Shana, who is a really good friend of ours. Ilana, who is new to our community. It's great to see you, Ilana. Lovely you could join. It's really cool.
Hi.
I just said hello to Ilana earlier today, so it's good to see you right back here.
Hey, everyone.
Good to see you, Ilana. Hello. And yeah, keep well. Have a great evening,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lia.
Thanks very much.
Bye. God bless.
Thanks.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Good to see you, Mum and Dad.